The tin hissed open, releasing the aroma of something forbidden. Franz's fingers trembled, not from fear, but shame. Kansas, 1944, and German POWs stared at American spam with suspicion born of propaganda. The first bite silenced the barracks. It tasted better, impossibly better, than what they'd been given at the front. A nervous laugh rippled through the men. Subscribed to witness how a simple tin of meat became their first taste of defeat. The war was already lost, not in bullets, but in abundance. Franz Meyer studied the rectangular tin turning slowly in his palms, the strange word spam embossed on its surface like some American incantation. The guards had distributed them without ceremony, one per prisoner, along with the small key-like openers. 21 years old and 3,000 miles from home, he sat on his bunk in the Kansas POW camp, surrounded by the hushed murmurs of fellow Wehrmacht soldiers who had been captured in the fields of Normandy months after D-Day. Outside, the flat American landscape stretched toward an endless horizon, wheat fields swaying under a relentless sun, so unlike the bombed ruins they had left behind in Europe. The barrack smelled of pine wood and sweat, of men trying to preserve dignity in captivity. Franz thought of the winter before, of the Eastern Front where he had spent 6 months before being transferred west. He remembered the perpetual emptiness in his stomach, the watery soup that passed for rations, the hard bread that needed to be soaked before it could be chewed without bleeding gums. He remembered how they had learned to ignore hunger pains by tightening their belts, how some men had collapsed during marches, their bodies finally surrendering to the slow starvation that the High Command pretended wasn't happening. Even when supplies arrived, they were meager, a mockery of sustenance that barely kept men on their feet, let alone fighting with strength and conviction against the advancing Russians. "Open it already," whispered Karl, the artillery sergeant who had taken Franz under his wing after they had both been captured near Saint-Lô. Karl was older, perhaps 35, with deep creases around his eyes that made him look like a man of 50. "The Americans aren't trying to poison us. Geneva Convention." There was a faint smile on his weathered face, but his eyes remained serious, watching Franz's hesitation with understanding. Karl had adapted quickly to captivity, accepting it as just another phase of this endless war, another landscape to navigate with pragmatic stoicism. He had already opened his tin, the meat inside glistening with fat and promise. The small metal key bit into Franz's thumb as he wound it around the tin, the metal peeling back to reveal a perfect pink block of meat packed tightly inside. The smell hit him immediately, rich, salty, somehow both foreign and familiar. It reminded him of Sunday dinners before the war, when his mother would roast a pork shoulder for hours, filling their small apartment in Munich with an aroma that drew neighbors to knock on their door with transparent excuses. That had been in another lifetime, before Hitler, before bombs, before hunger became the background noise of existence. Now, here was this small tin, this American marvel of industrialization, smelling of everything they had lost. Around him, other men were opening their tins with varying degrees of suspicion and eagerness. Some studied the contents as if expecting to find some hidden message, some trick. Others were already eating, using the small spoons that had been distributed alongside the tins. The sound of metal against metal echoed through the barracks, punctuated by occasional grunts of surprise. Franz watched Karl take a careful bite, saw his eyebrows rise slightly, his chewing slowing as if to savor something unexpected. "Well?" Franz asked, his own tin now open but untouched in his hands. The pink block seemed to pulse with accusation. "Try it," Karl said simply, and there was something in his voice that Franz couldn't quite identify, a strange mixture of resignation and wonder. "Try it and understand why we can never win this war." Franz lifted his spoon, carved out a small piece of the mysterious spam, and raised it to his lips. The meat was salty, rich with fat, substantial in a way that German rations hadn't been for years. It sat heavily in his mouth, On his tongue, the taste of defeat, somehow delicious and unbearable all at once. Something broke inside him with that first bite. Some final illusion about German superiority, about the righteousness of their cause, about the promised victory that had been drilled into them since boot camp. He chewed slowly, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes as the truth settled in his stomach alongside American plenty. The Eastern Front had been a lesson in deprivation. Franz remembered the first time hunger had truly visited him, not as a passing discomfort, but as a constant companion that hollowed out his thoughts until they echoed with emptiness. It had been during the retreat from Kursk, the German lines collapsing under the weight of Soviet counteroffensives. Their supply lines had been cut for 9 days. They had boiled leather belts for soup, chewed on roots dug from frozen ground, watched their breath crystallize in the bitter air as they huddled around fires that gave no real warmth. The officers maintained discipline with increasingly hollow assurances that supplies would arrive soon, that the Führer had not forgotten them, that victory was still within grasp if they just held on a little longer. Franz had been a believer then, still carrying the photograph of Hitler he had been given at 16 when he joined the Hitler Youth. He had traced the stern face with his fingertips on particularly cold nights, drawing strength from the image of the man who had promised to restore Germany to greatness. But as weeks turned to months, as winter deepened and rations dwindled to almost nothing, as men around him succumbed to frostbite and starvation, the photograph became less a talisman and more an accusation. He had tucked it deeper into his coat pocket, no longer taking it out where others might see his diminishing faith. The hunger had been a constant grinding presence, worse than fear, worse than the artillery shells that screamed overhead, worse than the knowledge that they were losing ground every day. The company cook, a former butcher from Dresden named Müller, had performed daily miracles with increasingly sparse ingredients. Franz would watch him stir enormous pots of thin soup, adding anything he could find: potato peels, the last withered carrots, occasionally small bits of horse meat when one of the artillery horses died from exhaustion or enemy fire. Müller would taste the brew with a thoughtful expression, add a pinch of salt from his dwindling personal supply, and then shake his head slightly, as if apologizing to some absent master chef for the culinary crime he was about to commit. "Dinner is served, gentlemen," he would announce with a theatrical flourish that somehow survived the worst conditions. The men would line up with their metal cups and receive their meager portion, thanking Müller as if he had just served them a feast at the Adlon Hotel. When they had finally reached a supply depot near Smolensk, after 15 days of retreat and near starvation, Franz had expected relief. Instead, they found chaos. Wounded men crying out for morphine that wasn't there, officers arguing over dwindling ammunition stocks, and food supplies that consisted mainly of hard black bread and tins of meat so poorly preserved that many had swollen with bacterial growth. The quartermaster, a corpulent man whose own ample frame seemed an obscene contrast to the hollow-cheeked soldiers, had distributed the rations with bureaucratic precision. 1 tin per 4 men, he had announced, checking names off his list as Franz and 3 others from his unit stepped forward. The tin they received contained a greyish meat paste that smelled faintly of chemicals and decay. They ate it anyway, scraping the sides of the container with their field knives, licking the metal clean. Later, in the relative safety of their temporary quarters, a half-collapsed barn that at least kept the worst of the snow out, Karl had produced a small flask of schnapps he had somehow managed to keep through the retreat. "To the Reich's finest cuisine," he had toasted with bitter irony, passing the flask to Franz. The liquor had burned a path down Franz's throat, momentarily distracting from the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. "My father fought at Verdun," Karl said quietly after the flask had made its rounds. "He told me they ate better in the trenches of the Great War than we do now. Said they had real meat twice a week, sometimes cheese, real coffee too, not this ersatz garbage." He had laughed then, a hollow sound that held no humor. "The glorious Third Reich can't even feed its master race." These memories swirled through Franz's mind as he sat on his bunk in the Kansas POW camp, the tin of Spam half empty in his hands. Around him, his fellow prisoners were eating with varying expressions, some with undisguised pleasure, some with conflicted shame, all with the slow, deliberate movements of men savoring food that exceeded expectations. Franz looked down at the remaining meat in his tin, at the way the fat glistened under the bare electric bulbs overhead. He thought of Müller stirring those enormous pots of watery soup, of the quartermaster's swollen tin of greyish paste, of Karl's bitter toast to Reich cuisine. The contrast was too stark, too painful to fully comprehend. This was American food for prisoners, not for officers, not for special units, but for captured enemy soldiers deemed unworthy of fighting. It was better than anything he had tasted in 2 years of service to the fatherland. 15 million cans a week, announced Oberst Weber, the highest-ranking officer among the prisoners. He stood at the center of the barracks, a tall, gaunt man whose uniform hung loose on his frame despite his efforts to maintain military bearing. The evening meal had concluded, the empty Spam tins collected by the American guards, who seemed amused by the prisoners' reactions to this ordinary food. Weber had always maintained connections, speaking passable English and cultivating relationships with the guards who might share information. Now he addressed the assembled men with the gravity of someone delivering intelligence of strategic importance. That's what our American Guard told me. Their factories produce 15 million cans of this Spam every week. Not for their soldiers, mind you. They get fresh meat. This is their surplus, their afterthought. A murmur passed through the assembled men, a ripple of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Franz sat on his bunk, Karl beside him, both men contemplating the implications of such production capabilities. 15 million cans weekly meant more than 60 million monthly, a number so vast it seemed abstract, disconnected from the reality of individual meals and hungry soldiers. Franz tried to imagine the factories that could produce such quantities. Vast buildings filled with machines and workers, raw materials flowing in endless streams, finished products marching out in perfect formation, like the soldiers they would feed. He thought of the munitions factory where his sister now worked in Munich, how she had described the constant shortages, the frequent breakdowns, the air raids that halted production for days. They have factories in Minnesota, Nebraska, right here in Kansas, Weber continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecture. Untouched by bombs, running day and night. While our cities burn, while our women and children huddle in shelters, these Americans build and build. Their workers sleep in soft beds. Their children grow fat on milk and eggs. Their factories churn out more food than their people can eat. He paused, surveying the faces of his men, reading the mixture of envy and resentment that flashed across features grown accustomed to disguising emotion. This is what we're fighting against, gentlemen. Not just their tanks and planes, but their abundance, their inexhaustible plenty. Karl shifted beside Franz, clearing his throat. In Normandy, before I was captured, I saw their supply dumps, he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the hushed barracks. Mountains of crates, stretching farther than I could see. We attacked one once, thought we'd struck a great blow. They had it rebuilt within 2 days, twice as large. They abandoned more supplies during their advance than we had in our entire sector. He laughed softly, a sound empty of humor. I watched our quartermaster weep when we captured an American food truck. Actual tears over cans of coffee and cigarettes. We distributed them like treasure. 1 cigarette per man, coffee so diluted you could read a newspaper through it. Still, it was a feast for us. The barracks had grown utterly silent, each man lost in his own memories of scarcity, his own confrontation with American abundance. Franz thought of the bread riots he had heard about in Berlin, of his mother's letters describing how she queued for hours for a few potatoes, of the increasingly desperate tone of Goebbels' speeches about sacrifice for final victory. He thought of the Eastern Front again, of men fighting in felt boots because leather was too precious, of tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, of artillery pieces rationed to 3 shells per day, regardless of the tactical situation. All this time, America had been making spam by the millions, casually feeding its prisoners better than Germany could feed its fighting men. Through the barracks window, Franz could see the Kansas twilight painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Crickets chirped in the tall grass beyond the fence, a steady rhythm that seemed to mock the disorder of his thoughts. An American guard strolled past, rifle slung casually over his shoulder, whistling a tune that might have been "Don't Fence Me In," a song the prisoners had heard on the camp radio. The guard looked well-fed, his uniform clean and pressed, his boots shining even in the fading light. He nodded to the prisoners watching from the window, a casual acknowledgement between men who no longer saw each other as immediate threats. The war continued an ocean away, but here in Kansas, its outcome seemed already determined, written in the language of production capacity and supply chains. "They will bury us," Weber said finally, his voice falling to little more than a whisper. "Not with bullets, but with butter, not with courage, but with corn and beef and spam. The victory was manufactured before the first shot was fired. We just didn't know it." He straightened his shoulders with a visible effort, attempting to reclaim some fragment of the dignity that had sustained him through capture and imprisonment. "Dismissed," he said, the military formality incongruous in their current situation, yet somehow necessary, a last grasp at the structure that had defined their lives. As the men dispersed to their bunks, Franz remained seated, the taste of American spam still lingering on his tongue, the taste of a defeat that had been inevitable from the start. The laughter began 3 days after the first spam meal, starting as a small ripple during the afternoon food distribution and building to a wave that crashed through the barracks with unexpected force. It was Kraus who triggered it, a former baker from Hamburg with a perpetual scowl and little tolerance for sentimentality. When the American guards handed him his tin of spam, now a regular part of their diet, he had looked at it with theatrical suspicion, turning it over in his hands as if examining a rare artifact. "Careful, gentlemen," he announced loudly, his voice carrying across the yard. "This is the Americans' secret weapon. They're killing us with kindness and cholesterol." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a snicker from somewhere in the line, then another, until the yard filled with the strange, cathartic sound of German prisoners laughing at their own defeat. Franz had joined in despite himself, the laughter bubbling up from some deep place he had thought permanently sealed by war and disillusionment. It wasn't joyful laughter. It carried too many complex emotions for that simple categorization. It was the laughter of men confronting absurdity, of soldiers who had been told they were the master race, while they starved on meager rations, now being fed to satisfaction by their supposedly inferior enemies. It was laughter that acknowledged the cosmic joke played on them by history, by propaganda, by the leaders who had sent them to fight an unwinnable war. The American guards watched with bemused expressions, not understanding the specific catalyst, but recognizing the universal language of men finding humor in misfortune. Back in the barracks, the mood had shifted from the solemn resignation of the past days to something more complex, a bitter mirth that allowed them to speak more openly about the contradictions they had lived with. "Remember those newsreels?" asked Schmidt, a former tank commander who had lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite before being captured in France. The ones showing American soldiers as soft, undisciplined, unable to withstand hardship. He was sitting cross-legged on his bunk, carefully cutting his portion of spam into precise cubes with his remaining fingers, a fastidiousness that had survived battlefield and capture. "I believed that garbage. Thought they'd break at the first sign of resistance. Then I saw them landing at Normandy, watched them keep coming, despite everything we threw at them. The Führer said Americans could build refrigerators but not weapons," contributed Meyer, a young radio man barely 19 years old, his face still spotted with acne. said they were good at business, but had no fighting spirit. He paused, pushing his glasses up his nose with a finger, his expression thoughtful. But they're not just fighting with weapons, are they? They're fighting with factories, with farms, with this. He held up his tin of Spam as if presenting evidence in a trial. The barracks fell silent again, the moment of levity passing as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by the heavier weight of realization. They had all been fed the same lies, had all absorbed them to varying degrees, had all now been confronted with their hollowness in the form of American abundance. Franz lay on his bunk that night, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into darkness, the creaking of wood as men shifted in their sleep, the occasional murmur of a dream-caught voice, the distant calls of guards changing shifts. Outside, an owl hooted softly, hunting in the fields beyond the perimeter fence. The Kansas night was different from European darkness, wider somehow, less densely packed with human history, more openly honest about its emptiness. Franz wondered what his family was eating tonight in Munich. His last letter from home, received 3 weeks ago, had mentioned potato soup stretched with sawdust bread, his mother's pride at finding a single egg for his father's birthday celebration. He thought of them sitting at their table under flickering lights, careful not to mention their hunger in their letters to him, just as he had been careful not to mention his own when writing from the front. The irony sat heavy in his chest. Here he was, a prisoner of war, eating better than his family in the fatherland, better than his comrades still fighting on increasingly desperate fronts. The Americans fed their captives with casual generosity, not as a special kindness, but simply because they could, because their system produced such abundance that even enemies could partake of it without strain. This was not mercy, but indifference, the indifference of wealth so secure it need not count every calorie, measure every gram. Franz wondered if this was the true face of defeat, not the dramatic fall of Berlin that Goebbels warned would bring Bolshevik hordes raping and pillaging, but this quiet humiliation of being fed by those you had been sent to kill, of recognizing in their careless plenty the bankruptcy of your own cause. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the barracks windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like memories that couldn't quite settle. The camp stirred to life, men washing at the communal sinks, guards calling roll, the smell of American coffee drifting from the mess hall. Franz sat up, running his hands through hair that had grown longer in captivity, feeling the stubble on his chin that he would soon shave with an American razor. Karl was already dressed, sitting at the edge of his bunk, writing in the small notebook he had been allowed to keep. He looked up as Franz stirred, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Sleep well?" he asked, though they both knew sleep came unevenly here, haunted by what they had seen and done, by the uncertain future that awaited them when the war finally ended. "I dreamed of home," Franz replied, the admission slipping out before he could contain it. "Of my mother's kitchen before the war. Sunday dinner, roast pork and potatoes." He paused, embarrassed by the simple domesticity of the dream, by how it revealed his longing for a world that might no longer exist. Karl nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I dream of food too," he said, his voice low enough that only Franz could hear. "Not of battles or glory or any of that nonsense they told us to dream of, just food and home and quiet rooms where shells don't fall." He closed his notebook, tucking the pencil into its spiral binding. "Maybe that's what we should have been fighting for all along." Franz didn't answer, but something in his chest loosened slightly, some knot of shame or confusion giving way to the simple recognition of shared humanity. They rose together to face another day of captivity, another day of American plenty, another day of the long defeat that tasted, impossibly, of Spam. The letter from home arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by an American sergeant who pronounced Franz's name with careful, exaggerated precision. "Meyer," he said, handing over the thin envelope that had traveled across an ocean and a continent to reach this Kansas field. "From Germany." Franz took it with hands that suddenly trembled, recognizing his mother's neat, economical handwriting, the way she formed her letters to use as little space as possible, a habit born from years of paper rationing. He retreated to his bunk, turning the envelope over in his hands, noting how the American censors had opened and resealed it, how the German postal marks were overlaid with Allied handling stamps, the physical manifestation of his country's loss of sovereignty, of borders breached and systems overrun. Karl gave him privacy, engaging the nearest guards in conversation about baseball, a sport the prisoners had begun to follow through camp broadcasts. Franz carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the single sheet of thin paper inside. His mother's words were sparse, constrained by censorship and caution, but between the lines he could read the deteriorating situation in Munich. Food shortages had worsened. The bombing had intensified. His sister had been moved to an underground munitions factory. His father, too old for military service but conscripted into the Volkssturm, stood night watches with a hunting rifle manufactured before the First World War. Between these grim details were the usual maternal concerns. Was he eating enough? Was he warm enough? Did he need socks or undershirts? Franz smiled bitterly at the irony. Here in captivity, he had gained back the weight lost on the Russian front, his uniform now fitting properly for the first time in years. "It's hard to get letters," said Meyer, who had received nothing since his capture despite writing weekly to his family in Dresden. He sat on the bunk opposite Franz, watching him fold the precious paper back into its envelope. "The bombings, you know. Whole post offices destroyed, whole neighborhoods." He pushed his glasses up again, a nervous habit that humanized his increasingly adult face. "My mother always said no news is good news. I try to believe that." Franz nodded, tucking his letter beneath his thin pillow, uncertain how to respond to the younger man's obvious worry. What could he say? That Dresden was likely a target for the Allied bombing campaign, that mail service within Germany was collapsing along with everything else, that Meyer's family might already be among the countless civilian casualties. Instead, he offered the only comfort available. "You can read mine if you want. It's nothing special, but it's something from home." A dinner that evening featured spam again, this time mixed with American macaroni and a cheese sauce that delighted some prisoners and disgusted others. Franz ate methodically, his thoughts still lingering on his mother's letter, on the contrast between his relative comfort and their increasing deprivation. Across the table, Oberst Weber was engaged in philosophical discussion with several former university students, their voices low but intense. "The question," Weber was saying, cutting his food into precise portions, "is not whether Germany will lose, that is now evident, but what kind of defeat it will be. Will it be like 1918, where we could tell ourselves we were betrayed rather than beaten? Or will it be absolute, undeniable, a defeat so complete it forces a national reckoning?" Franz listened without contributing, considering the implications of Weber's words. The 1918 defeat had shaped his childhood, the bitterness of adults who believed Germany had been stabbed in the back, the economic chaos that followed, the desperate search for scapegoats that Hitler had so effectively exploited. His own father, a minor civil servant with traditional values, had joined the Nazi Party not out of ideological fervor, but from a desire for order, for someone to blame, for a promise that Germany would never again know such humiliation. Now here they sat, prisoners in America's heartland, eating America's surplus food, while Germany faced a defeat far more conclusive than the last. What myths would they tell themselves this time? What new resentments might ferment in the ruins? After dinner, the prisoners gathered in the recreation area, where the Americans had installed a radio that received limited broadcasts, mostly news and music, carefully selected to avoid sensitive military information. Tonight, the program featured American big band music, the brassy sounds of Glenn Miller filling the room with alien rhythms that some of the younger prisoners had secretly enjoyed even before capture. Franz sat near the back, watching his comrades' reactions, some tapping their feet despite themselves, others maintaining rigid postures of rejection, as if enjoying enemy music might constitute a further surrender. Karl joined him, carrying 2 cups of the weak coffee that accompanied their evening meal. "A letter from home?" he asked, nodding toward the envelope Franz still carried in his breast pocket. "Yes," Franz confirmed, taking the offered cup. "Munich is being bombed heavily now. Food is scarce. My mother asked if I'm getting enough to eat." He laughed softly, the sound catching in his throat. "I didn't tell her about the spam in my last letter. Didn't want to worry her with how well the Americans treat their prisoners." Karl nodded, understanding the complex shame in being safe and fed while loved ones suffered. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the music, watching the odd social dynamics of men who had been trained to kill Americans, now cautiously adopting their cultural products. A prisoner from Berlin was teaching 2 others a dance step he claimed to have learned in a basement jazz club before such music was banned. Their movements were awkward, self-conscious, but persistently joyful, a small reclamation of pleasure in a world that had demanded only sacrifice. As twilight deepened into true night, Franz stepped outside the recreation hall, needing a moment of solitude. The guard at the door nodded permission. The camp's security was relatively relaxed, the fences more symbolic than necessary in this vast Kansas landscape where escape would mean only wandering lost through endless fields. The night air carried the scent of distant rain, of earth warming after a long winter, of growth and renewal that continued regardless of human conflicts. Franz looked up at the stars, the same stars that shone over Munich, over the battlefields of Europe, over the homes of American soldiers fighting in his homeland. The vastness made national boundaries seem absurd, arbitrary lines drawn by men too small to comprehend the wholeness of the world they divided. He thought of the spam tins, of American abundance, of the 15 million cans produced weekly while Germany starved. The war had been lost long before the first shots were fired, lost in factories and farms, in production capacity and resource availability, in the fundamental contest between systems that the battlefield merely formalized. Franz reached into his pocket, touching his mother's letter, thinking of her question about whether he had enough to eat. How could he tell her that he sat in enemy captivity with a full stomach while she scraped pans for remnants? How could he explain that he had tasted the future in American spam, had eaten tomorrow while Germany clung to a past that never truly existed? The night offered no answers, only the distant rumble of thunder moving across the plains, a sound like artillery but bringing only rain, only life, only the ceaseless turning of a world that would continue long after this war, and all its hollow certainties had been forgotten.